In the second week of our course on the history of economic thought, we'll briefly be looking at some of the ancient Greek thinkers, Aristotle, Plato, Heraclitus, and well, we may have many good reasons to look at the Greek philosophers. One certainly is the fact that the very term economics comes from the Greek and economia, and it means the management of the household. And the Greeks may have had a few interesting things to say about economic matters. We'll look at those when we, for instance, look at what Aristotle had to say about money and the accumulation of money and lending money. And certainly that would have influenced the thinking, the economic thinking with regards to lending money and charging interest rates hundreds of years later, at the time of the scholastics. That's the Middle Ages, around about 1200. But we're also looking at the Greeks in particular because they're introducing some terms and notions that are important for us, for theory in general, for economic theory in particular, but really for all thinking about any type of theory. And so what we want to get at is this distinction that I've got here between nominalism and realism. And I've got to explain those two terms. What they are, what nominalism and realism are two answers to the question, what is the meaning, what is the status of our general terms that we are using in theory? Now, we're using lots of general terms in economic theory. We talk about competition, prices, supply, demand, trade, the firm, costs, and of course the list will go on and on. But it's not only in economics, it's also in international trade, international relations. There's talk of peace, cooperation, international trade per se. In psychology, there might be use of the words like consciousness, the mind, and these are all very general terms. And when we communicate with each other, we communicate in terms of general terms, in abstract terms. And it's important to have a bit of an understanding what the status is of those particular terms. Let me just give an example to show what's at stake here. And I'm going to take an example from, well, much later than the Greek philosophers. We'll get back to them. We'll take examples from them too. But I'm looking at the time of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, as you may know, well, you're going to get to know, he wrote not only The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote a text called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, at some point in that text, he gets into an argument and elaborates on the thinking of someone by the name of Bernard de Mandeville, who wrote at the beginning of 1700. And de Mandeville wrote a book or a poem called The Fable of the Beast. In it, what he said was that virtue doesn't exist. There is no such thing as virtuous behavior. And if people are trying to exhort one another to be virtuous, or if they're claiming to be concerned with the good of the world and the good of other people, then they're just maybe not lying to themselves, but lying to everybody else, because virtue as a type of thing, if you like, doesn't exist. All that we can see, according to de Mandeville, is that people are acting in self-interested ways, but what they do in order to curry favor, they will frame it in terms of being virtuous. And if people are trying to do good, meddling with the life of other people in the name of being virtuous, in the name of wanting to attain the good for all, then what they're really doing is they're meddling in their own interests. But they try and make it look nice by claiming that they're doing it for the good of people. And so if you look at politicians, for instance, they might be making big statements and long speeches about the good of all. Um, uh, but the cynic, and de Mandeville was a cynic, he'd be saying, well, that's just a way of manipulating the population, manipulating other people, but it's really to the benefit of the politician who's making those speeches. There is, in other words, simply said, no such thing as species. Let me give you other examples of this type of approach and view of the status of those general terms. Let's take an example from Charles Darwin on the origin of species. On page 55, there in the blue. Can you read this? It reads, "From these remarks, it will be seen that I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and that it is not essentially different from the term variety, which is given to less distinct and more fluctuating forms. The term variety, again, in comparison with mere individual differences, is also applied arbitrarily and for mere convenience." So he's saying species don't really exist, and we use the term nonetheless because it is convenient to do so. So he's saying that the species of horses doesn't exist. We're looking at individuals. We, so to say, draw a circle around them and say, well, these individuals they resemble one another sufficiently for me to group them together. But there's nothing that really is underlying that name horse. I'm just using that, as he says, term arbitrarily. It's the sort of approach we see again elsewhere. Let me use this example. And another example that I may want to read out to you is taken from the work of Max Born, Nobel Prize winner in physics. In 1935, he published a book by the name of The Restless Universe. And what he writes there is the following. "It is odd to think that there is a word for something which, strictly speaking, does not exist, namely rest." And if you're looking at atoms, as Max Born would have done, you'll see that atoms are not at rest at all. Nothing is at rest really, because everything is made up of atoms. And when you're looking at an atom, you've got electrons that are bobbing around the center of the unit of the atom. The examples I've given you are examples of a nominalist attitude towards abstract terms and general terms. So we need to look at more precisely what is meant by nominalism. So let's take that out again. Here, nominalism. Well, its root is nomina, and that is referring to names. And what we may want to ask is, well, what sort of things does one name? Each of you's got a name. You probably, if you have a dog, the dog's got a name, I hope so. If ever you have children, what's the first thing you're going to do about the child? You're going to name it. Some people go as far as naming their car, giving it a specific name. And even if we have things that are just numbered, the numbers are featuring like a name. So car registrations are numbers, but they are identifiers of individual things. So the things that we name are exactly that, individual things. And the approach of nominalism is that the only things that exist are individual things. And so in principle, we could give a name to every individual leaf, if you like. There's a story by a famous novelist, I think he was Argentinian, Borges, and he wrote a short story called Funes the Memorious. And that's what he did. He was a sort of man who wasn't able to think in general terms. He thought only in terms of individual things. He saw only the individual, if you like. He would look at a tree and he wouldn't see just a bunch of leaves. No, he would identify and recognize every leaf as it is different and unique from compared to all the other leaves. And so effectively, even in his memory, he had a memory of everything he saw individually, every individual leaf, every drop of rain. And well, the poor man, of course, he died, if you like, from an overload, memory overload, because he had so much stored there. He didn't have the notion of the general. And so that's an extreme example of nominalism, where the individual is the only thing that is really recognized. So when you're looking at a horse, you see an individual horse, but you know that there are other horses like that, and that's why we are using the term species, no matter what Charles Darwin says. We're using the term species because we think that there is something that is common to all the horses, and because there's something common to all the horses, we're calling them horses. Because there's something common to all human beings, we call them human beings. We're all unique, but there seems to be something common. Well, nominalism holds that no, what really the only thing that there is the individual human being. There's no such thing that is common to human beings. We don't share anything with anybody else. The only thing that exists is the individual. And so what the nominalists are saying, I take again the example of Darwin, he's saying that, well, we can group certain animals together and call them horses, but we're doing so only for convenience sake. We've grouped it arbitrarily and we've given it a name like horses, but that's not because there's something specific or something general and common to all the horses. No, we've given that name horse, we're just giving it as a name to that group of things. Not because there's something common to them, but because it is convenient for us to talk about these things which are similar somehow or another. But we've grouped them together, and the group is what we call the horses.